This is August 17th, 1985, at the first of many Point staff alumni reunions. Surrounding the table, we have some of the gentlemen that were responsible for the camp we've all known to grow and love over the years. Starting on the left, we have Orly Thornsjoe, the program director in 1947, followed by Boots Hansen, who has told probably more fish stories about the lake than anyone I know.
Some of them true.
Some of them true, very few, but all involving large fish. Next is Wint Hartman, who was the director of camping for the Minneapolis Area Council at the time the camp was formed. Next, Maury Ostrander, the camp director the very first summer, followed by Siebert Rasmussen, who is responsible in part for the building we're standing in right now, the dining hall. And we should note that Siebert just celebrated his 102nd birthday. He attributes it to being Norwegian.
And living a good, clean life.
Does that help? And what we would like to do is just to get kind of a perspective on Many Point, why it's here, why it was at the time a very daring endeavor. And I think that would be best answered by Wint, who was the director of camping for the Minneapolis Area Council at the time. He could, if you would, Wint, give us some perspective of what scout camping was before Many Point and how it was different with the formation of this camp.
Well, the Minneapolis Consul, it was then the Minneapolis Consul, not the Viking Consul. The Minneapolis Consul had a principal camp on Lake Minnetonka, which was known as Camp Tonkawa. And there was also another camp on Wauwatasso Island, originally known as Camp Robinson Crusoe. And these were camps that I went to as a boy, and were very successful camps. The difference between that kind of camping and the camping that we do today is that those were mass camps in which you took a single boy out of his troop, sometimes more than one out of the same troop, but single boys out of their troop, and took them to camp and formed provisional troops and provisional patrols. The Many Point venture, after some experimentation in the consul camps of Tonkawa and Wauwatasso and Ness Lake and Stearns, was an effort to put emphasis on making an opportunity for a scout to come to camp with his own troops and with his own troop leader. And this idea had its beginnings in the Minneapolis Consul under the leadership of a scout executive who came here in 1939 by the name of Lee Cornell. And, he had an idea that there could be a great scout reservation that would provide increasingly challenging opportunities for scout troops to come to camp, having done as Baden-Powell suggested in his original scout manual, 50 weeks of scouting in the scout troop in preparation for summer camp. However, the refinement of that here at Many Point, which had not been done before anyplace else, was that the goal was a kind of a perpetual motion, and that is that it was 50 weeks of scouting in the scout troop in preparation for summer camp. But summer camp as a continuing process, getting the troop ready for the year ahead, so that the things that they did together as patrols and as the troop in camp made the troop a better troop under better leadership and under better organization than it had been the year previous. So this plan of camping caused the Minneapolis Council to venture out into a new field of perpetual motion in scouting, in which the troops experience in the troop room, the church basement, or the schoolhouse, or wherever it was, led to summer camp. Summer camp led them back into the troop room, back home with better organization, better leadership, and better able to profit from the skills of scouting during the year.
That, again, Wint, who in the council was your, I guess, strongest supporter for this idea? I would suspect with Takwa being at that time probably 20 minutes out of Minneapolis, did some people, or were some people critical of driving 4 hours, probably 5 hours then, by car to a remote place in northern Minnesota?
Oh yes, that was, you know, new ideas are always difficult to sell to people. This was different, and there were some people who were, I wouldn't say they were critical of it, they were just scared. They were afraid it wouldn't go, but this was short-lived, and in the first year that the camp operated, why it was demonstrated that this was really not a very serious consideration. And as we talked to people about it, we said to them, well, you often get in your car on Friday night, don't you, and drive up into northern Minnesota for a day and a half fishing and drive home again on Sunday night. You drive a lot farther than the 235 miles to Many Point Scout Camp, and so this was rather short-lived.
When did the acquisition of land begin?
Well, there was a group of men from the board of directors that worked with me and with Lee Cornell in the selection of the Many Point Scout site. There were, in all, we looked at 25 different sites in the state of Minnesota, beginning in 1942, the latter part of 1942, and into 43, and into the spring of 44. Before this camp was definitely, this site was definitely decided upon at that time. And this site had many things to offer that other sites that we had looked at did not have to offer. For example, this site was rich in the history of Minnesota's past and of the country's past in terms of the pioneers who had lived here on the shores of this lake, the Indians who had lived here on the shores of this lake, the old legends that there were about the logging and pioneering that had been done along the banks of the Otter Tail River. This was a contiguous body of land that we attempted to put together of about 1,800 acres. It was 24 different parcels, the principal one of which was the 800 acres that was owned by the Many Point Rod and Gun Club. And in addition, this site had one other very redeeming feature, and that is that although the council would own only about 1,800 acres, which if you stop to think of it is a far cry from the 29 acres at Camp Tonkawa, the council would own only 1,800 acres. There was adjacent to this 1,800 acres, 177,000 acres of the Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge. And in the work that we did with the Department of Interior, we secured the right to have our scouts go into that 177,000 acres of the Tamarack Wildlife Refuge and have remote and rugged camping experiences in that area on the far side of the lake. And of course, this was a very desirable arrangement because it was like owning 177,000 acres.
Wint, let me suggest something in relation to Brent's question. Tell them about the final fateful board of directors meeting that was held on Christie's Point that made it happen.
There were some resorts on this lake. Siebert ran a small resort across the lake. There was Whaley's Resort. There was a man by the name of Wilson who was our friend off and on, ran a resort over there. There was a resort down at the far end of the lake known as Christie's. And there was also a resort known as Bill's Point. When we started to be interested in this land, neither Christie's nor Bill's Point were in operation. The year that the final decision was made...
They may not know where Christie's and Bill's Point are.
Well, Bill's Point is the place where the family camp now is, and right straight across to the point that is really at the south east corner of the lake there, I guess, was Christie's Point. And one of the interesting things that Siebert remembers, I'm sure, and Boots, is that down at the far end of the lake where the Otter Tail River flows out of the lake here, there was an old bridge, and it was made up of 2 logs. That's all it was. It was just 2 logs, the width of an automobile tread, that went across the Otter Tail River. And the loggers who worked up here drove their trucks across there and didn't seem to have any trouble at all. So we brought the board of directors of the Minneapolis Consul up here in the summer of that year, and we didn't tell them about this bridge because we were afraid they wouldn't come. But anyway, we made arrangements to put them up down at the old Christie Resort. And some of them had grave doubts about what we were doing to them as they approached this bridge and rode across on the 2 logs. All you had to have was a steady hand, otherwise you'd just fall in the Otter Tail River, that's all. And so we had this weekend that began on a Friday night, and the men on the board, some of whom had been here previously, toured the land, came down to this end of the lake and into Fishhook Bay, and walked out along the little Beaver Creek, walked out along the old railroad grade that's now the entrance to the camp, walked over the property of the Many Point Rod and Gun Club, and on the final evening...
Excuse me,
yeah.
why don't you mention for the group who some of the key figures were on that board?
Well,
and what was their station in life?
Very substantial people on that board of directors. Mr. Art Larkin, the president of Republic Creosoting, was the president of the consul then. There was Art Digert, who was the operating vice president of Ingersoll, or of can't think of the name of the milling company. of one of the big milling companies in town. There was Fred Paul, the city engineer. There was Charlie Bealey, who is of the John Deere Farm Implement family. A number of those people. There were about, in all, there were about 30 men from the board who came up here, and on that final night, we had a campfire down there at Christie's. Orly and I walked to it this afternoon, and prior to that campfire, in the afternoon, the men had made the decision that this was to be the site of Many Point Scout Camp. And so that afternoon I went out into the woods and cut a big sheet of birch bark. And we wrote out on that sheet of birch bark a commitment for all of us and all of them for the building of Many Point Scout Camp. And at the campfire that night, each of those men came up and signed that birch bark scroll, and I rolled it up and put it into a big 2-gallon bean pot, and dug a hole side of the fire and buried it in the ground out there. And I don't know whatever happened to that. When I left Minneapolis in 1943 to become the director of camping in Philadelphia, that bean pot with the ashes from that campfire and that scroll was on the shelf in my office, and I don't know what's happened to it since then.
Before camp really got going, you hired a man that had been working at Northern Pump. Would you be interested in saying a few words about him, and then maybe he can defend himself?
Well, I hired a fellow, he was to be a temporary employee, that was my understanding. And I hired him to come up here, and we had a scout service camp that year. A number of Eagle Scouts who lived down at Christie's Point and built trails and did other things that were necessary to the preliminary development of the camp. And they worked mornings, and sometimes when Boots was kind of ornery, they worked into the afternoon, but they were supposed to have the afternoon off. In any event, Boots came and took that job, and he was to stay through the summer. And at the end of the summer, while we were starting the building of the camp here, and Boots said, well, now he had to go back to his family in town, and so he'd have to be leaving, and I said, well, come on down to Gaylord's Lodge, the log lodge of the gun club, which played in those days a very important part in the development of this camp. And I said to Boots, come on down, we sit on the porch down there. And so I persuaded Boots to stay another 30 days. And he agreed to stay another 30 days, and he and I never discussed it again after that. We never discussed another 30 days beyond the 30 days. And after, what, 29 years,
He discharged me.
this temporary employee finally went home.
You worked out okay? You worked out okay then?
I guess
We
so.
never discussed it.
Often enough.
Do you have any response to that, Boots? Were those good years?
They were pretty good, yeah. But when the first brought my family up to the tar paper shack down there that he lived in, and I moved over from the Point. And one cold winter night, he gave me a stack of blueprints this big and this long. And he says, here, camp opens in June of 1947. And all you saw around here was buildings without any windows in, no doors, nothing. And then in the spring of 47, we had part of it done, but we had the contractor here, and Wint and I and the contractor sat upstairs, and we told him that next Monday you have to move out because our cooks are coming in. And he sat there with tears in his eyes and he says, I haven't finished. Tough luck, but our cooks are coming in. So he moved out on the back here and our cooks moved in. Then the next day he left for the L. Then this building wasn't finished, so we hired Severton to finish it and with the other crew. And then in the spring of '47, this guy came up, Maury Ostrander, to direct the camp. And he called a meeting one night with the whole staff. We sat over there where those people are sitting now. That was the meeting place. Since then, why they got to sit them out here because there ain't enough room over there. But first period staff, I think, had 18 people in total staff. Then in December of 1946, I went to Minneapolis and brought my family up. It was, I think, the 7th of December. And I brought the kids in and mommy, and took them up to the cabin, which wasn't finished yet. And for 2 cents, all of the kids would have gone back to Minneapolis. And but they stayed, and after they'd been there a while, you couldn't move them out.